Winter, 1881. Northern Montana Territory, 40 miles south of the Canadian border. The kind of cold that makes men question their choices. Nobody understood why Elias Caldwell was building a barn around his cabin, until the first snow proved he wasn't building a barn at all. What looked like madness in October became the most copied structure in the valley by spring. And it started with something every homesteader faced, but few solved: firewood that wouldn't burn. See, wetwood wasn't just inconvenient on the frontier. It was dangerous. A fire that won't catch means a cabin that won't warm. And a cabin that won't warm in Montana winter means children coughing, wives shivering, and men making desperate choices. Elias Caldwell solved it with something so simple that experienced builders laughed at him. They called it wasteful, called it paranoid, called it the work of a man too soft for hard country. Then January came, and the laughter stopped. The difference wasn't subtle. It was measurable. It was the kind of difference that makes a man survive winter instead of endure it. The kind that makes neighbors stop talking and start watching. Because when your family is cold and your firewood won't light, pride doesn't keep you warm. Hit that subscribe button right now, and I'll show you a frontier hack so simple that half the valley copied it within 2 winters. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know who else battles wet firewood. Because what you're about to see isn't just history. It's engineering that still works today. And if you stick around until the end, you'll see the exact measurements that proved a 62-year-old carpenter wrong and changed how an entire region built their homes. Elias Caldwell was 34 years old in the autumn of 1880, a former logger from Michigan who'd moved west with his wife Rebecca and 2 young children. He knew timber, knew how to fell it, mill it, dry it, burn it. That knowledge was supposed to make Montana easier. It didn't. The problem started in September 1880. 3 weeks of cold rain, the kind that soaks through tarps and finds every gap in every shelter. Caldwell's firewood, 2 cords stacked in a standard 3-walled shed, open front facing south, turned from seasoned fuel to waterlogged pulp. When he tried to burn it, the logs hissed and smoked. Flames wouldn't catch. The cabin filled with gray smoke that made his children cough through the night. His wife Rebecca wrapped the kids in every blanket they owned. The temperature inside the cabin hovered around 48 degrees. Outside, it was 32 and dropping. Caldwell tried everything the experienced homesteaders recommended. Brought wood inside to dry by the fire, but wetwood doesn't dry fast enough when you need it now. Split it smaller, but wet splits just expose more wet surface. Cover the wood pile with canvas, but wind-driven rain found every seam. The standard firewood shed wasn't enough. Not in Montana, where autumn rain turns to sleet, sleet turns to snow, and snow gets driven sideways by wind that doesn't stop for months. By mid-October, Caldwell was spending 3 hours a day just managing firewood, chopping ice off frozen logs, trying to dry them near the stove, splitting wet wood that wouldn't burn cleanly. His hands were raw. His back ached. And every morning, the cabin was colder than the night before because a fire had died to coals that couldn't catch on damp fuel. Rebecca didn't complain, but he saw it in her face. The worry, the exhaustion of keeping children warm in a cabin that leaked heat faster than wetwood could produce it. She'd stopped asking when things would get better. That's how he knew they wouldn't. Not without changing something fundamental. He had a decision to make. And he had materials most homesteaders didn't. Leftover milled lumber from a sawmill venture that had gone belly up the previous summer. Rough-cut planks, more than he needed for repairs, sitting in ewes behind the cabin. Enough to build something bigger than a shed. Enough to try something different. So in early October 1881, Caldwell started building. But he wasn't building a bigger woodshed. He was building a shell around his entire cabin. The plan was desperate and simple. His cabin measured 16 by 20 feet. He constructed an outer wall 24 by 28 feet, enclosing the cabin completely. 4 feet of space on all sides. A peaked roof extended 3 feet beyond the inner cabin, covering the gap. Vertical plank walls, tight enough to shed rain and snow, but with ventilation slots near the roofline. A single door through the outer shell, then a 4-foot walk to the gallery, then the cabin door. Firewood would stack in that 4-foot gallery, floor to ceiling, protected on all sides, accessible without ever stepping into the weather. He wasn't trying to invent anything revolutionary. He was trying to keep his fuel dry and his family warm. That's it. The simplest possible solution to a problem that was stealing sleep and health from everyone he knew. The work took 3 weeks. He built the frame first, then added the walls, then the roof. Rebecca helped when the children napped. They worked without talking much, just the sound of hammers and saws and wind coming down from the mountains. When neighbors passed by and asked what he was building, Caldwell said, "A place to keep the wood dry." Most of them nodded and kept writing. A few lingered, watching, clearly puzzled by the scale of it. But when neighbors saw what he was building, they didn't see practical. They saw strange. Picture this: a small log cabin, 16 by 20, sturdy but unremarkable. Now, picture that cabin sitting inside a much larger lumber structure, like a box inside a box, with a 4-foot gap running all the way around. That's what Elias Caldwell built in October 1881. The outer shell measured 24 by 28 feet. Rough-cut vertical planks, 8 inches wide, overlapped to shed water. The peaked roof extended 3 feet beyond the inner cabin on all sides, creating a covered gallery that encircled the entire structure. At the roof line, Caldwell left 6-inch ventilation slots, gaps where the walls met the roof, to let air circulate and moisture escape. The gallery itself was 4 feet wide, enough room to walk comfortably, enough room to stack firewood from floor to ceiling along the interior walls. The firewood faced inward toward the cabin. The outer walls took the weather. Entry required 2 doors. First, you opened the outer door, a heavy plank door that faced south. You stepped into the gallery. Then you walked 4 feet through a corridor of stacked wood. Then you opened the cabin door and stepped into the living space. To his neighbors, it looked absurd. Like a cabin inside a barn, one said. The structure dwarfed the actual living space. Most homesteads use less lumber for entire barns than Caldwell used for his outer shell. And for what? A fancy wood shed? A 4-foot hallway that served no purpose except keeping a man from walking 10 feet to a normal woodpile? The double door system looked paranoid. The wasted space looked inefficient. The whole design looked like the work of someone who didn't understand how frontier life worked. Some said it looked like he was building a fort. Others said it looked like he was hiding from winter instead of facing it like a man should. One neighbor, a trapper named Samuel Voss, stopped by in late October and walked the perimeter twice. He stood there, hands on his hips, staring at the outer walls. Finally, he said, "You know that's a lot with just to keep it dry, right?" Caldwell shrugged. Voss shook his head and rode off. But here's what Caldwell understood that they didn't. Rain and snow would hit the outer shell and run off. The firewood would never get wet. Not from above, not from the sides, not from wind-driven precipitation. The wood would stay as dry as if it were stored inside a barn, because, in a sense, it was. The ventilation slots meant air could move through the gallery. Humidity wouldn't build up. Moisture wouldn't condense on the wood or the walls. The gallery would breathe, just enough to stay dry without letting weather in. And here's the part Caldwell hadn't fully planned for but suspected. That 4-foot air gap would insulate the cabin. Outside air hitting the outer shell would have to cross 4 feet of still air before reaching the cabin walls. Wind chill would drop. Heat loss would slow. The cabin would hold warmth longer. Even better, and this part was pure accident. The cabin's residual heat would radiate into the gallery. Not enough to make the gallery warm, but enough to keep it above freezing. Enough to passively dry any firewood that came in damp. Enough to prevent ice from forming on the wood stored there. Caldwell had also noticed something else during construction. When he stood in the gallery on a cold morning, the air felt noticeably calmer than outside. The wind couldn't reach him. The outer walls blocked it completely. That meant the cabin itself wasn't taking the full brunt of Montana wind. And wind chill is what kills heat faster than anything else. He didn't have the language for it, but he created what builders a century later would call a thermal buffer zone, an airspace that moderates temperature swings, blocks wind infiltration, and passively conditions both the structure and its contents. He'd stumbled into physics that wouldn't be formally studied until the 1900s. None of this required complex engineering, just walls, a roof, and an understanding that air is insulation, that drywood burns, and that keeping weather away from fuel matters more than pride. But try explaining that to men who'd been stacking wood the same way for 20 years. The comments started before Caldwell finished the outer walls. "You building a chicken coop for your house, Elias?" That was Henry Stratton, a neighbor 2 miles east. He'd stopped by in mid-October, watched Caldwell nail planks to the frame, and couldn't keep the grin off his face. The joke spread. By the time Caldwell added the roof, half the homesteaders within 10 miles had heard about the man building a barn around his cabin. At the trading post in early November, Rebecca Caldwell overheard 2 women talking. One said it looked unnatural. The other said her husband called it a waste of good lumber. Lumber that could have built a proper barn or extended a living space. "Seems like Elias doesn't trust Montana to treat him fair," one of them said. Rebecca didn't respond. She bought her flour and left. The mockery was malicious. It was the kind of ribbing men give each other when someone does something that doesn't fit the pattern. But it carried weight. In a place where survival depends on shared knowledge, going against the grain makes people nervous. It makes them wonder if you know something they don't, or if you're just foolish. When Rebecca got home that day, she told Elias what she'd heard. He was stacking the last row of firewood in the north gallery wall. He didn't stop working, just kept placing logs, checking gaps, making sure air could flow between them. "Let them talk," he said quietly. But she saw the tightness in his jaw, the way he worked a little faster, a little harder. Words had weight, even when you pretended they didn't. The children heard it too. At the one-room schoolhouse 12 miles south, another boy asked Caldwell's son why his father was scared of snow. The boy came home silent that day, wouldn't eat dinner. Finally told his mother what had been said. Rebecca held him and told him his father wasn't scared of anything. But doubt is a seed, and it had been planted. Then Jacob Rourke showed up. Rourke was a carpenter, 62 years old, 20 years in Montana, hands like gnarled wood, and a reputation for building structures that didn't fall down. If you wanted to know whether a cabin would stand, you asked Jacob Rourke. If he said it was solid, it was solid. If he said it was foolish, people listened. Rourke arrived at Caldwell's place on a cold afternoon in late October. He walked around the structure slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes studying the outer shell, the roof line, the ventilation slots. Caldwell didn't say anything, just kept stacking firewood in the gallery. Rourke stopped at the ventilation slots, squinted up at them, shook his head slightly. He ran his hand along the outer planks, checking joints, testing for gaps. Then he walked the full perimeter again, slower this time, as if making sure he wasn't missing something obvious. Finally, Rourke stopped near the door. He shook his head. "Wood don't dry in the dark," he said. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "That gallery's going to rot your fuel faster than rain ever could. No sun, no air movement, just damp and shadow. Mark my words, come January, you'll be burning mush." Caldwell looked at him, wanted to explain the ventilation, the air gap, the way heat would radiate from the cabin. But Rourke had 20 years of Montana winters behind him. Caldwell had one. So he nodded and went back to stacking wood. Rourke left. The story spread. "Jacob says the gallery will rot his wood." Other comments followed. "Real men stack wood outside and shovel when they need to. He's scared of a little snow. Too soft for hard country." At the trading post, men started calling it Caldwell's coop. The chicken coop joke had stuck. Samuel Voss, the trapper who'd visited earlier, told a group at the post that Caldwell had more wood in his walls than in his pile. People laughed. It became the kind of story men told to fill silence on cold nights, the kind that made them feel better about their own choices. Caldwell's wife heard it. His children heard other children repeat it. And Caldwell himself started to wonder if Rourke was right. He'd built the structure on instinct and logic, but he didn't have proof. Just a guess that keeping fuel dry and wind out would matter more than tradition. So he kept quiet, finished stacking the wood, checked the ventilation slots, sealed gaps where rain might get through. and waited for winter to deliver the verdict. Because words don't matter on the frontier. Results do. 18 inches of snow in 3 days. The kind that buries wood piles and turns paths into guesswork. Temperatures dropped to 12 degrees below zero and stayed there. For 40 consecutive days, the thermometer never rose above freezing. Most homesteaders had seen worse. Montana winters weren't predictable, but they were manageable if you prepared right. Stack enough wood, keep it covered, shovel paths, feed the fire. It was hard work, but it was known work. Then December brought something different. A brief warming. Temperatures climbed into the high 30s for 2 days. Snow turned wet and heavy. Ice on rooftops melted and refroze into thick ridges. Wood piles that had been frozen solid began to thaw, and the moisture trapped inside the logs wickered to the surface. Then the temperature dropped again. Fast. Within 6 hours, it fell from 38 degrees to 8 below zero. Everything froze. Not just froze, encased. A 3-day ice storm coated the landscape in a half-inch glaze. Trees bent under the weight. Wood piles became solid blocks of ice. Logs that had been stacked neatly were now fused together, immovable, slick, and frozen through. Homesteaders across the valley faced the same nightmare. To get firewood, you had to hack it free. Men spent an hour with an axe and a pry bar to break loose a single log. And when they finally got it inside, the wood wouldn't burn. It was too wet, too cold, too soaked from the thaw. Fires sputtered and smoked. Cabins filled with gray haze. Families huddled in coats and blankets, trying to coax heat from wood that refused to cooperate. Jacob Rourke's firewood shed, a sturdy 3-walled structure with a good roof, partially collapsed under the ice weight. He spent 2 days rebuilding it and another 2 chopping frozen logs free from wreckage. His hands were bleeding by the time he got enough fuel inside to last a week. The wood smoked when it burned. His cabin stayed cold. Henry Stratton's wife told Rebecca Caldwell at the trading post that they were burning furniture. Chairs and a small table, she said quietly. The firewood won't catch. My husband's been outside for 3 hours this morning trying to break logs free, and he got 4 pieces. 4. Her voice was flat, exhausted. Rebecca touched her arm, but didn't know what to say. Samuel Voss, the trapper, broke his axe handle trying to pry logs from his frozen pile. He rode 15 miles to the nearest settlement to buy a replacement and found 6 other men there for the same reason. The blacksmith had run out of axe handles. Voss had to wait 3 days for a new shipment. People noticed that smoke from Elias Caldwell's chimney didn't struggle. It rose steady and clean. No one heard the sound of an axe striking ice from his property. No one saw him outside in the worst of the cold, wrestling with frozen logs. Some assumed he'd abandoned the homestead. Others thought he must be burning through his stores faster than expected, that he'd miscalculated and would run out by February. A few suspected he was burning furniture too, but was too proud to admit it. No one guessed the truth. Caldwell was inside his cabin, warm, feeding the fire every 8 hours with that lit on the first match. His children played on the floor, without coats. Rebecca baked bread without shivering. The gallery surrounding the cabin stayed just above freezing. The firewood stacked there as dry as it had been in October, untouched by ice, untouched by moisture, waiting to be used. He didn't go outside to tell anyone, didn't ride to the trading post to explain, just kept his family warm and waited for someone to ask. Stay with me, because what happens next made Jacob Rourke eat every word. And the number you're about to hear made 17 families rebuild their entire firewood system before the next winter. Late January 1882. The ice storm had passed, but the cold hadn't. Temperatures held steady between 0 and 10 below for 2 weeks straight. Every homesteader in the valley was rationing firewood, trying to stretch what remained until spring thaw made cutting easier. Martin Howell needed to borrow a saw. His had cracked in the cold while cutting frozen timber, and he'd heard Caldwell had an extra. Howell lived 3 miles west, close enough to consider Caldwell a neighbor, far enough that they didn't talk often. He rode over on a gray afternoon when the wind had finally died down. Howell knocked on the outer door, waited, knocked again. The door opened. Warm air rolled out. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the 15 degrees outside. Howell stepped into the gallery and stopped. The temperature difference hit him immediately. It wasn't warm, not like inside a cabin, but it wasn't outside either. He guessed mid-30s, maybe higher. Warm enough that his breath didn't fog as thick. Warm enough that the cold didn't bite through his coat in seconds. Then he looked at the firewood. Stacked floor to ceiling along all four walls. Hundreds of pieces, and every single one was dry. Bone dry. He reached out and touched a log. No frost. No ice. No moisture. The wood was light, seasoned, ready to burn. He picked up a piece and examined it. The bark flaked off in his hand. The grain showed clean and tight. This wasn't wood that had been protected from weather. This was wood that had been cured. Caldwell appeared in the doorway between the gallery and the cabin. "You need something, Martin?" Howell set the log down. I came for a saw. But..." He gestured at the walls of stacked wood. "How is this dry?" Caldwell shrugged. "It's out of the weather." "Jacob Rourke," said Iditarod. Jacob was wrong. Howell walked along the north wall, running his hand over the logs. All dry. He stopped at the ventilation slots near the roofline, squinted up at them. Cold air moved through, just a whisper of it, but enough to carry moisture out. He turned back to Caldwell. "And you're staying warm in there?" "Warmer than most, I'd guess." Howell borrowed the saw, rode home, told his wife what he'd seen. That night, he told his neighbor to the south. Within 3 days, 6 families had heard the story. Within a week, people were riding past Caldwell's place just to see the structure up close. The numbers came together slowly, but they came together clear. By mid-February, it was obvious that Caldwell's cabin was consuming far less firewood than anyone else's. His neighbors were burning 28 to 35 logs a day just to keep their cabins above 50 degrees. Caldwell was burning 12. Same size logs, 16 inches long, 6 inches in diameter. Same type of wood, mostly pine, some Douglas fir. Same brutal cold outside. But his cabin stayed between 62 and 68 degrees. All day, all night. When the fire died down to coals overnight, the temperature inside dropped to maybe 58 by morning. His neighbors woke at the cabins in the low 40s, sometimes colder, and had to rebuild fires from scratch with wood that barely wanted a light. Fire maintenance was the other difference. Caldwell refueled every 8 to 10 hours. Most homesteaders were feeding fires every 2 to 3 hours, especially when burning wet or semi-frozen wood that produced more smoke than heat. Samuel Voss, the trapper who mocked the design, rode over in late February. He didn't ask permission, just walked into the gallery through the outer door and stood there. Caldwell came out to see who it was. Voss didn't say anything at first, just looked around. Finally, "What's the temperature in here?" "Gallery? Maybe 35, 40 degrees. It's 6 below outside." "I know." Voss walked to the firewood, touched it, picked up a piece and tested the weight. "Set it down. This has been here since October?" "Most of it." "And it's dry?" "Yes." Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I burned my table last week. Kitchen table. For chairs the week before that." His voice was flat, factual, not asking for pity, just stating reality. "I got maybe 3 weeks of fuel left if I ration. You got enough here for 2 winters. Caldwell didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say. Voss left without asking for the saw or tools or anything else. But 2 weeks later, he came back with a question. "How far out from the cabin walls did you build?" "4 feet. And the ventilation slots?" Caldwell explained. Voss took notes on a scrap of paper. The data that mattered most came from Jacob Rourke. Rourke showed up in early March. The worst of winter had passed, but it was still cold, still hard. He knocked on the outer door. Caldwell opened it. Rourke stepped in the gallery and stood there exactly like Martin Howell had, exactly like Samuel Voss had, taking it in, measuring it with his eyes. He walked the perimeter slowly, touched the firewood, looked up at the ventilation slots, checked the joints where the outer walls met the roof. Finally, he turned to Caldwell. "I was wrong about the dark." Caldwell waited. Wood doesn't need sun if it's got air and heat. And you got both. Rourke gestured at the cabin walls. Heat comes off that cabin, keeps the space above freezing, dries whatever moisture tries to settle. The slots let the damp out, but keep the weather out. He paused, searching for the word. It's smarter than I gave it credit for. Thank you. How much would you burn a day? About 12 logs. Rourke's jaw tightened. I'm burning 30. More on the coldest days. He looked around the gallery again. This space, it's not just keeping you dry. It's insulating your cabin. Wind can't get to your walls. Cold air hits that outer shell and stops. Your cabin sitting in a pocket of calmer air. That's what I figured. You figured right. Rourke walked to the door, stopped, turned back. 17 families asked me this week how to build something like this. I told them I'd need to see it again before I could say. So I came to see it. He met Caldwell's eyes. I'm going to tell them it works. Then he left. The numbers became common knowledge by late March. Caldwell had burned roughly 60% less firewood than his neighbors over the course of the winter. His cabin had maintained a temperature 15 to 20 degrees warmer on average. The gallery surrounding his cabin had never dropped below 32 degrees, even when outside temperatures hit 20 below, and the firewood stored there had stayed dry, cured, and ready to burn from October through March without a single piece rotting or freezing into an ice block. When spring finally came and people could move freely again, the conversation shifted. It wasn't about whether the design worked. It was about how to build one. Spring 1882 brought thaw, mud, and questions. Martin Howell was the first to start building. He didn't ask Caldwell for help, didn't announce his plans. Just started framing an outer shell around his cabin in April. His version was narrower, 3 feet instead of 4, and he left the south wall open, turning it into a 3-sided gallery instead of full enclosure. He wanted the sun to reach the firewood directly. By May, 2 more families had started similar projects. One built a full enclosure, like Caldwell's. The other built an L-shaped addition on the north and west sides, where the wind had hardest and left the south and east open. Jacob Rourke stopped by each site, gave advice, adjusted measurements. He didn't charge for the consultations. When someone asked why he was helping, he said, "Because it works, and I was wrong to say it didn't." That was as close an apology as Rourke ever gave, but in a place where words were scarce and pride was expensive, it meant something. By autumn 1882, 4 families had completed their versions. 3 more were in progress. The designs varied. Some used full enclosures, others partial wraps. A few incorporated the gallery into an extended porch system, but the core idea was the same: protect the firewood, create an air gap, let the cabin heat radiate into the buffer zone, block the wind. Samuel Voss built his in June. He came by Caldwell's place to show him sketches, asked about ventilation placement, about lumber thickness, about whether to use planks or split logs for the outer walls. Caldwell answered every question. When Voss finished his structure in August, he rode back over with a smoked ham as thanks. "I won't forget burning my furniture," he said, "and I won't forget who figured out how to avoid it." The technique spread quietly. No newspaper articles, no formal announcements, just neighbors watching neighbors, seeing what worked and adapting it to their own needs. By the winter of 1883, 11 homesteads within 50 miles had some version of the gallery system. By 1885, the number had grown to 17. The local sawmill in Helena, 60 miles south, started offering gallery packages in the spring of 1884, pre-cut lumber size for wrapping standard 16 by 20 or 20 by 24 cabins. The mill owner had heard about the design from a freighter who'd passed through the valley. He didn't know Caldwell's name, just called it the Montana Wrap in his advertisements. The packages sold steadily for the next decade. Caldwell himself never promoted the design, didn't talk about it unless asked, didn't claim credit or seek recognition. He'd built it to solve a problem, and it had solved the problem. That was enough. But the transformation was real. Within 5 years, the gallery system wasn't seen as strange anymore. It was just how you built if you wanted to stay warm and keep your firewood dry. Travelers passing through the region started noticing the double-wall structures, the enclosed galleries, the outer shells that turned cabins into something that looked, at first glance, like small barns. Some called them fuel barns. Others called them Montana wraps. A few called them winter shells. The name didn't matter. What mattered was that they worked. By the 1890s, the design had spread into Idaho and Wyoming, carried by homesteaders who'd lived in Montana and moved on, or by carpenters who'd seen the structures and understood the principle. It became part of the vernacular architecture of the northern Rockies. Not universal, but common enough that no one questioned it. And it started because one man refused to accept that wet firewood was just part of winter. Here's what Elias Caldwell understood that others missed. The problem wasn't the weather. The weather was constant. The problem was exposure. Fire would expose to rain, snow, ice, and wind will fail you when you need it most. But firewood protected by walls, kept in a space that breathes but doesn't flood, warmed by residual heat from the structure it's meant to heat, that firewood becomes reliable. He also understood something deeper, something that took the rest of the Valley of Winter to learn. Insulation isn't just about thick walls. It's about air. Still air. Air that can't move freely, can't carry heat away, can't drive cold through gaps and cracks. That 4-foot gallery wasn't wasted space. It was a thermal barrier that did more to keep the cabin warm than doubling the thickness of the cabin walls ever could. Modern building science calls it a thermal buffer zone. Engineers today use air gaps, ventilated cavities, and radiant barriers to control heat flow in buildings. They'll tell you that a well-designed airspace can be worth more than inches of insulation. They'll show you studies, diagrams, thermal imaging. Elias Caldwell didn't have any of that. He had wet wood, cold children, and leftover lumber. He had a problem, and a guess about how to solve it. The guess turned out to be right. The frontier didn't reward theory. It rewarded what worked. And when winter made the verdict, no amount of pride or tradition could argue with 60% less wood and a warm cabin. If you made it this far, you understand something most people miss. The best solutions don't come from trying to impress anyone. They come from solving real problems with what you have. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Hit that subscribe button. Because next week I'm showing you the underground root cellar technique that kept food frozen in summer without a single pound of ice. It's another piece of frontier engineering that's been forgotten, but shouldn't be. And if you thought this gallery system was smart, wait until you see what Montana homesteaders did with stone, earth, and gravity to create refrigeration that never stopped working. Thanks for watching. Stay warm. And remember, sometimes the craziest idea is the one that saves you.